Hello, this is Simon Brew. I've been having doubts about whether to let this podcast live or die. I'm going to ask Kenneth. What, live? Oh. All right, Kenneth, let's go on. Just thanks to you.
Yes!
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, title gives this one away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film. And I tend to talk about all sorts, really. Development stories, marketing stories, production stories, release stories. All the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The movies I tend to choose for this podcast, they have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. I think there's quite a lot of that around at the moment. Instead, this is a celebration of the fact that films get made. It's really difficult to get films made, and I just want to salute those who manage to do so, really. So without further ado, I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of the podcast. We've got two really upbeat films in this particular episode. For the first of them, I'm going to take you all the way back to 1994. I'll play you a clip from the trailer of the movie in question. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
No one need ever die. I will stop this.
No, you can't achieve death.
We won't know unless we try.
I warn you, what you are suggesting is not only illegal, it is immoral.
What's happened to you?
Yes, that's the combination.
That then was a clip from 1994's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, directed by Kenneth Branagh, with a screenplay by Steph Lady and Frank Darabont, based on the book, well, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, starring Robert De Niro, Kenneth Branagh, Tom Hulce, Helena Bonham Carter, Aidan Quinn, Ian Holm, John Cleese, and the late great Richard Briers, also in the ensemble. But the story of this particular film, well, it was fired up by two different successes that led to the idea of trying to bring a very authentic take on Mary Shelley's novel to the big screen. So first up, there was 1992's hit movie Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, which I've covered before in more detail on a previous episode of this podcast. But for the purposes of this story, Bram Stoker's Dracula was a sizable hit, albeit one with a little bit of a backlash, but nonetheless, it brought in an awful lot of money. And it led to Coppola exploring a run of films based on classic horror stories in pretty much the same vein. If you like, this would almost be a little cinematic universe of its own, long before that thing became a thing. Now, the other success that fired this one up was 1993's Shakespeare adaptation, Much Ado About Nothing, directed by and starring Kenneth Branagh, a film I love an awful lot. Keanu Reeves links both Bram Stoker's Dracula and Much Ado About Nothing, if you want a little bit of pub quiz trivia. But in terms of Branagh's directorial career at that point, it was pretty much 4 for 4. His Henry V movie had been nominated for Oscars and had done well. He'd followed that up with an American thriller, Dead Again, which I'll come to in a future episode of the podcast. He'd come back to the UK to do Peter's Friends. That had gone down well. I have covered that one before as well. And so it was heading towards the time to tackle a much bigger project. He was in his early 30s at this point. At the moment, he came onto Francis Ford Coppola's radar. Now, once Dracula was complete, or before Dracula was complete, Coppola was exploring the idea of doing Frankenstein. It was a project he was looking to direct himself. That at this stage there were a possible light trilogy of films that he was working on, with The Wolfman likely to be the third of them. But the making of Dracula had really taken it out of him, and so he elected to take on a producer role with Frankenstein through his American Zoetrope production company, and the search was on for a director to take on the project. Now, there were names in the mix here. Roman Polanski was said to have been approached and apparently turned this one down. There's an internet rumour that Tim Burton was sounded out with Arnold Schwarzenegger in the cast, but I can't really find much to back that up. But while the search for a director was going on, American Zoetrope was continuing to develop the film. That screenwriters were coming in. Frank Darabont and Steph Lady would come in and do adaptation of the screenplay and work through that. And as Branagh in a report in the Los Angeles Daily News back in the early 90s, he was ultimately approached and noted that he wasn't particularly interested in tackling Frankenstein when he got the first draft screenplays through. Now, Coppola had set the project up at TriStar Pictures, where Dracula had been set up as well, and there were a couple of scripts that were sent over to Branagh, but what he did is he went back to the novel and saw something in it and thought that actually, he wouldn't mind having a go at this one. So Coppola had got the script in motion, and by this stage, Frank Darabont, who I'm going to come to in the second film I'm talking about in this episode as well, in the same year, ironically, that The Shawshank Redemption was released, the Frankenstein movie would ultimately come out as well, but he'd penned a screenplay for the feature, working, as had Steph Lady, and Darabont post-release would have words about this. For Steph Lady, it was her first produced screenplay, and James V. Hart, who had adapted Dracula for the big screen for Coppola, he came in and helped with the process as well. The deal had to some degree been packaged originally by Creative Artists Agency, the hugely influential talent agency in Hollywood at the time. But the important thing was the project was up and running. Coppola wanted to do it, TriStar wanted to do it, there was a script in place, and Branagh was now interested in doing it, to the point where he agreed to meet Francis Ford Coppola in New York. And it turned out to be quite a big day, because that was also the day that Branagh would also meet Robert De Niro for the first time. Because by this stage, De Niro was also on the project's radar. Branagh, when he was originally spitballing ideas for who could play the creature in the movie, well, Gerard Depardieu was fairly high up his list. But both Coppola and Branagh were interested in De Niro, and so Kenneth Branagh had quite a 24 hours. So the night before this meeting, he played Hamlet in the UK. And then after that performance, he got on a Concorde. He zoomed over to New York. He met Coppola in the afternoon in the city. And then in the evening, they went and had a meeting with De Niro at De Niro's restaurant at the Tribeca Centre in New York. De Niro gave them the tour of the restaurant, and as Branagh would recall, was really very proud of it. And they got on. It said they sensed that there was something there. Now, Robert De Niro's not a person to commit to a project after one meeting, though, and it took 2 or 3 more meetings between Branagh and De Niro and Coppola before he would ultimately commit to this one. But by this stage, Branagh was on board as well. And so it was in November 1992, I found an article in Variety which confirmed that Branagh was directing the film and would also co-star in the movie as well, that TriStar was going to back it. TriStar had pushed for Branagh to be the director as well. It was really behind the idea, and the movie was pushing forward. So, with De Niro and Branagh as the leads of it, well, Branagh would then spend quite a lot of time earning De Niro's trust on this one. Thus, throughout 1993, in the 9 months really building up to filming, and according to an interview with the Chicago Tribune, Branagh would either go to the US or De Niro would come to the UK, but crucially, the pair would meet up at least once a month to discuss the role and to discuss the project. And the background work was sizable. I mean, De Niro's known for this anyway, but also, as the article in the Chicago Tribune noted, they consulted doctors and and plastic surgeons to learn about the movements and behaviour of people whose limbs have suffered damage and been restored to use. The article added they studied speech-impaired people because in this version, Dr. Frankenstein's creature isn't a mute character, and Branagh was quoted as saying the creature actually sounds as if he's been put together from bits and bobs of other people's bodies and trained to live again. And so Branagh added, when De Niro speaks, you won't recognise it as a contemporary sound. What you'll see will be worth your $7.50. You will be scared. $7.50. Imagine going to the movies being that cheap. I remember an interview around the time as well where Branagh talked about just how surreal it was to have De Niro round at his house. He was married to Emma Thompson at the time, and the three of them had dinner at his home, and just what a strange moment that was to invite him in. But over the course of the 9 or 10 months of preparation, they continue to evolve the look of the creature. The idea that they wanted it to be a patchwork creation, that they really wanted to get to the nuts and bolts of what they felt the novel was about, notwithstanding the fact that the actual creature transformation and coming alive moment in the novel is very brief. Branagh instinctively knew this was going to be one of the most cinematic moments in the film. He was also bulking himself up for his own role in the movie. And it would be fair to, I mean, when he came to make Thor and directing Chris Hemsworth in that, he always told a story of how he was really nervous about asking Chris Hemsworth to take his shirt off and was quite shy about it. And Hemsworth, when he was finally asked, replied and said, I've not buffed up for all of this for nothing. I do wonder if Branagh could relate a little bit to that when he was directing himself in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There was very much this desire to lean closer to the text than the many previous big screen tellings of the story, but that's not to say that they didn't decide on changes, because, I mean, one in particular was the character of Elizabeth, as ultimately played by Helena Bonham Carter. She was strengthened from the character that you would meet in the book. Helena Bonham Carter wasn't the original choice in there. In fact, there were a couple of various bits of casting, bits and bobs here, because at one stage, Christopher Lambert, not for the role of Elizabeth, he was in the cast, but he would step away and Tom Hulce, known of course for Amadeus, would replace him. Branagh had wanted to cast Emma Thompson, as he had done in his previous 3 movies, but she'd been offered a role in Carrington opposite Jonathan Pryce. Now that was a film that earned an awful lot of rich acclaim and a really complex role, and she took that instead. And in fact, as it would turn out, Carrington would end up shooting next door to Frankenstein at one point. It's worth noting, just for the purposes of this briefly, that Thompson and Branagh would separate not too long after Frankenstein. And I think you can read on the internet just any particular ins and outs of that. That's not really my interest or concern, but I just wanted to note it. Hugh Bonneville will join the cast of this one as well, and this would be his feature film debut. And Branagh also brought in some of his familiar old ensemble too, and some of his old friends. He brought in John Cleese, he brought in Richard Briers. He brought in Celia Imrie too, and Patrick Doyle, the composer of the film, also gets a little cameo in this one, just uncredited in the midst of it all. So this had come together, that Coppola seemed happy with it, Branagh seemed happy with it, and on the 21st of October 1993, production began on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, fairly soon into filming, actually, this one made some headlines because the veil of secrecy over the movie was intense, because they knew, and this was really pre-internet age, really. I mean, there was a nascent World Wide Web going around, but nothing like the atmosphere in which a film is made now, of course. But they knew that their trump card, really, in terms of the promotion, was the reveal of how Robert De Niro's creature was going to look in the film. Now, De Niro really went through the mill on this one, that the makeup effects on him took hours and hours to put on and hours to take off. I did read a story around the time, which I couldn't find again, typically, which just suggested at one point his shooting schedule was just changed slightly. So he only had to, for a little bit of the shoot, come in every other day to actually go through that process. So extensive was it. But nonetheless, it was protecting the image of what the creature was going to be. And the film was set up primarily at Shepperton Studios, where it shot just outside of London. It did some location work in the Swiss Alps, in Switzerland, obviously enough. But the producers obtained what was described as a groundbreaking injunction on this one, that a freelance photographer had been on the set at Shepperton and had taken shots of De Niro whilst the said photographer was on the set and reportedly tried to sell them. Now, these were said to be unauthorised pictures, and a judge ruled in favour of the film's producers, and the injunction was duly granted on this one. Branagh would admit, I mean, he gave several interviews around the time of the film's release, but he would admit to sleepless nights during the filming of this movie. He said that's not massively uncommon for him, but also this was his biggest film by far to this point. It was working from a budget of 45 million. It was also working with a huge acting star as well. And this was comfortably double the size, really, of anything he'd tried to do before. He'd worked with movie stars before, of course, but the sheer scale of this production was a long way ahead of anything that he'd previously tackled. Now, one person who had tackled films of this size was Francis Ford Coppola, of course, and it was said that the working relationship between Branagh and Coppola suffered during the making of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that there are numerous stories that the pair didn't see massively eye to eye during the shooting of the film, and this would come to a head particularly during its post-production. Now, I'll come to that a little bit more shortly. But Branagh's routine for the making of the movie was he would shoot for 5 days a week, then he would edit during the weekend. And of course, he would have to put his own performance in the midst of it all as well. And I think it was when he was promoting the film Jack Ryan, Shadow Recruit, I did ask him how he goes about directing himself when he's in the midst of a film like this. And he always talked there about how he did his scenes, he recorded his scenes when he was at his freshest. Now, the difference between Jack Ryan's Shadow Recruit and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is he's pretty much front and centre of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, whereas he takes on the villainous role in the Jack Ryan movie. And so here, the onus was constantly on him. He was tabloid fodder at this point as well. There was a swirl of interest around him and around Emma Thompson. And there was also the sense that here was the person who built up and built up and built up, and it was his time to take a fall. And I think some of that played out in the way the press in particular responded to the movie. The schedule was a long one. This one was in the studio really for the best part of 4 or 5 months, I think it was. Some actors came in just for a week or two each. I mean, John Cleese, who took some convincing to get TriStar to sign off on the casting of him, and Richard Bryce, for instance, they just came in for a couple of weeks on the movie. It was De Niro and Branagh who were the constant front and centres of it. And then it would all wrap up by, I think it's 25th of February 1994 is the date that I've got where shooting ultimately concluded on the film. Then there was quite a lot really still to go. In particular, De Niro's schedule sounded insane at this point, that he was bouncing from film to film. And so there was some lip syncing he would have to come in and do on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And to do that, he would have to fly in from his New York home, then to head to the film's London base where it was all being put together. Once he'd done his lip syncing work, then he was straight off to Las Vegas to start making the film Casino with Martin Scorsese. The bigger problem, though, in post-production, and neither has spoken directly about this, I should point out, was the continual fracturing of relationships between Branagh and Coppola. Now, Branagh gave a very extensive interview to Empire magazine, which did an excellent feature on the making of the film when it came out, and he talked about how he was in awe of De Niro and Coppola both before and after the making of the film, and he sort of had to put it a little bit aside during the actual production of it. But by the time it got to putting a cut together, Coppola and Branagh were not on the same page. That in particular, the story goes that Coppola wanted to re-edit the opening of the movie, that he didn't think Branagh had got that right. Branagh stood his ground on this one. He knew what he wanted to do. And so Coppola would then distance himself from the project. And he really took what was described as something of a back seat on this one once it became clear that Branagh was going to fight very hard for his cut and go with his cut of the film. The film was also testing at this stage, and the test screenings were, well, stories of those were bubbling up as well. And in fact, going back to that Empire article, Branagh was open about some of the responses to the test screenings, that there had been complaints that were bubbling up in the Hollywood trade press that early screenings of the film, the audience had found it too violent, for instance, and Branagh was on board with that. It's just like, it's a horror film, was his argument. He argued that his Frankenstein movie would stack happily next to the violence of other mainstream movies of that era as well. He didn't think he was doing anything particularly over and above there, but still these stories bubbled into the press. I would suggest that if you're making a horror film, and this was building to an October release date, that having stories that your film is violent and scary and unnerving people isn't necessarily a bad thing to have in the press. But also the press surrounding the film, whilst it hadn't been outright nasty, was rarely being particularly positive. So Branagh, on the eve of the film's release, he was quite sanguine about it in the interviews he was doing then, appreciating he was knackered, that he'd say done the best job really that he could have done, but also he had been deep in the trenches on this for 18 months and would be open about the fact that he was absolutely exhausted by the time this one came to release. That release then, well, it landed, it debuted at the London Film Festival on November the 3rd, 1994, and got a broader release the day after. And it would be fair to say the reception on the whole to the movie was not a positive one. Now, it's worth contextualising that the reception to Bram Stoker's Dracula hadn't been off the board positive, but nonetheless there was a clear regression in critics' response here, that there were, it got to the point where some major critics put this on their worst films of the year list, which I think is incredibly harsh. But nonetheless, there was a feeling that this one just hadn't worked, that it wasn't actually in the end that scary, that it was violent, that it was very, very, very cinematic. The editing and the pace of the first half hour was in particular really quite divisive. Now, my own personal thing is I've always enjoyed this film. I can see its flaws, but I just think as a flowing piece of cinema, I always think it's quite interesting. And I watched it a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this. However, I should see that my view on this one is pretty much in the minority. And as I always quote, but Blackadder goes forth, Edmund Blackadder say, you can't argue with the box office. And as it turned out, they couldn't argue with the box office. This one opened a lot flatter than Bram Stoker's Dracula. That Dracula had gone at 25-30 million opening weekend for a film with an adult-centric rating to it, not that kind of adult behave. It opened in second place at the American box office with $11.2 million, and this was seen as a disappointment. It could not dislodge the opening film from the week after, Stargate, which held the top spot for a second consecutive week. It did hold off the other big opener of that week, although it was playing on half the number of screens, The War, starring Elijah Wood and Kevin Costner. The other films in and around the top 10 that week in the US, well, the Pulp Fiction was hanging on in fourth after a month on release. The Specialist with Sylvester Stallone and Sharon Stone and James Woods was at 5. It had The River Wild that was in at 7. Forrest Gump had been around for, about 4 months at that point, at 9. Underrated Alan Parker movie called The Road to Wellville, that was hanging in at 10. And there was a new entry in 12th place, the video game adaptation Double Dragon, and crikey, what a film that was. The Shawshank Redemption was hanging around in 14th, but it was dropping out of the charts at relative speed there. And the director of The Shawshank Redemption, Frank Darabont, was one of those who ultimately would have his say on how he felt Mary Shelley's Frankenstein turned out. He would just say it's kind of like the movie I wrote, but not at all like the movie I wrote. He said it's the best script I ever wrote and the worst movie I've ever seen. And I'm going to go out on a limb and just suggest that Frank Darabont, who was talking to creative screenwriting, was not a massive fan of that film. He said, if you love that movie, you can throw all your roses at Ken Branagh's feet. If you hated it, throw your spears there too, because that was his movie. The film ultimately, by the time it completed its box office run, I mean, it did actually do $112 million worldwide. It would be remiss to call this a flop. Conversely, it fell a long way short of how Dracula had done. In the US in particular, it only did $22 million, and that was regarded as a sizable disappointment. Also, the response to the movie wounded Branagh a little, and he would be open about this over time. Coppola duly abandoned his plan to do The Wolfman in the aftermath of Frankenstein's release. Branagh would go back to basics, though, and he would take some of the money that he'd been paid to do Frankenstein and invest it in one of my favourite of his films that I talked about in a podcast last Christmas, In the Bleak Midwinter, or A Midwinter's Tale if you live in the US. And he would reflect while promoting that film to the Los Angeles Times. He says of Frankenstein, "It's a film I wouldn't have made any other way, and I'm very proud of it, but it clearly didn't strike the right chord with lots of people." And he said, "But the fact is, it's done 100 million theatrically worldwide. I wish more people had liked it, but it will still make its money back. That's not much of a disaster." And he doubled down on this with a separate interview in the Chicago Tribune where he argued, "I made the film exactly as I wanted, and that makes it worse, because you realise you put your heart and soul into something that in the end most people thought wasn't very good, and people said you must have been interfered with, but he argued the studio executives were very good about it. It's my picture, the responsibility is mine." When you think about it, it's just a film. The world didn't stop turning, as I recall. The sun rose the next morning, but it did shake my confidence. It was a tough time for me. However, In the Bleak Midwinter would be something of a creative reboot for Branagh. He would go on to do his long-cherished big-screen adaptation of Hamlet, for which, bizarrely, he would get an Oscar nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay, when, effectively, I think he would concede this, he pretty much just put the text of the play on screen. Coppola would go on, from this point on, though, to be a director for hire, really. He would do films like The Rainmaker and Jack, and I think it'd be fair to say not very Francis Ford Coppola films. But this particular attempt to launch a range of horror films off the back of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein just topped out after 2 movies. As a result of that, I think the Frankenstein movie is a little bit sneered at. I don't think that's necessarily fair. I do think it's worth having a look at, but I don't think anyone involved is really calling it a raging success either. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Just a few little notices then. I've got a new issue of Film Stories magazine shipping at the moment. If you're not familiar with our independent film magazine, it's a mainstream film magazine that kind of shines a light more on the films in the smaller rooms in the multiplex. Its feet are very much in British cinema, but we do cast our eye further afield as well. And there's loads of writing from new and old writers alike. You can buy copies of it at store.filmstories.co.uk. We do ship it all over the world, as we do with our magazine for under 15s, the world's only ongoing print magazine, I think, for under 15 film lovers. That's called Film Stories Junior. Copies of that available at store.filmstories.co.uk as well. In terms of this podcast, I am wholly reliant, really, on you all to keep going. You've got me this far. This is episode 202 now, I think, unless I've lost count. The reason I get this far is because of your support. And if you do like this podcast, there are 3 ways you can support it. And I'd be hugely appreciative for any of these. First of all, if you could subscribe to it, that helps enormously at your podcast host of choice, your podcast repository of choice. Also, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that too would be massively appreciated. And then you can support this podcast on Patreon as well, patreon.com/Simon Brew. You get the podcast early, you find out what I'm up to early, and a few other gossipy bits and bobs that I tend to put on there. Thank you to everybody who supports and backs me. But that's enough notices. I think it's time I get on with the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. It's Frank Darabont's name is going to come up again. I'm going to, there's no way around this. I'm going to now move to a horror film from 2007 that is not on the happy side. Let me play you a clip from it, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Whoa. Mom, Dad, you gotta come see. The boathouse is all bashed. You just gotta... Come on. Whoa.
Having spoken, the doomsayer departs.
Come on.
Why don't you get Billy dressed? I'll take him into town with him. Hit the store before it gets all bought out.
How'd you folks hold up in the storm?
Big insurance day.
Sorry to hear that.
doors! Shut the door!
The only way we're going to help ourselves is to seek rescue.
Tie this around your waist.
For 4.
Let us know you got at least 300 feet.
There's nothing out there. Nothing in the mist.
What if you're wrong?
Then I guess.
Well, crikey, that is a clip from 2007's The Mist, based on the book by Stephen King, screenplay by Frank Darabont, directed by Frank Darabont, starring Thomas J, Marcia Gay Harden, Laurie Holden, Andre Braugher, Toby Jones, William Sadler, Jeffrey DeMunn, Francis Sternhagen, Sam Witwer, Alexa Davalos, and Nathan Gamble in the ensemble for this one. And I think it's fair to say that if Frank Darabont felt that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was not a reflection of the film that he wanted to make, The Mist would very much be a reflection of the film that he wanted to make. But then based on the story by Stephen King, it was in the early 1990s that Darabont first got hold of the rights to make the movie. Now, by this stage, he'd made his directorial debut with Woman in the Room, which he'd written as well. But he'd written or co-written films like A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Blob and The Fly 2. He'd worked on Tales from the Crypt. He'd worked on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. But the short story The Mist was always one that was in his head. And so as he came towards making his full directorial debut, he zeroed in on The Mist at this point, that it was going to be that project. This was the one he was going to make. Only it wasn't, because at that time, instead, he'd opt to direct another Stephen King novella into a feature film, which would go on to be The Shawshank Redemption. Now, the story with The Shawshank Redemption is he wrote the screenplay, and Rob Reiner of Castle Rock and director of things like Stand By Me and The Princess Bride and Spinal Tap, he desperately wanted to direct the film, but Darabont stood his ground, was able to direct it, and I think it's fair to say a much-loved movie was made as a result of that. But it was also a much-loved movie that pushed the making of The Mist back. For his next screen directorial outing, Darabont once again went with Stephen King, with whom he'd got a good relationship. Now, he toyed at this stage in the mid to the second half of the 1990s again with bringing The Mist to the big screen, but instead he opted to make The Green Mile with Tom Hanks in the lead role, again based on a Stephen King story. And this too would be an Oscar draw. It would this time as well be a box office hit. The Shawshank wasn't a box office hit on original release, but would go on to be a sensation on home video. That Darabont was 2 for 2 here. He directed 2 Stephen King adaptations. They've both been incredibly well received, and ultimately they're both each proven to be commercially profitable as well. So then he moved on to his first box office disappointment, and this would be a very notable change of direction, almost the Capra-esque, really, The Majestic, starring Jim Carrey, released in 2001, released by Warner Brothers. It's a film that has its fans, and it's quite a sweet one, but it was the first of his directorial outings to not really hit. Nonetheless, he was still of interest to Hollywood studios, and why wouldn't he be? And so a first look deal was in place with Paramount Pictures, and under that deal with Paramount, he continued to work on The Mist, that it was bubbling back up, and the plan was on for him to return to the world of Stephen King. But as the early 2000s moved on, Darabont also moved away from Paramount, that he would eventually set up the project elsewhere. And it was in 2004 it became clear that this was going to be his next film. He gave an interview with Fangoria at that time where he pretty much confirmed it and said he was looking for films like Night of the Living Dead to be a touch point. And the hint was there straight away that this wasn't going to be a Paramount film. This hadn't been announced at this point, but Darabont was quoted as saying, whether it's a studio picture or not, I want to go with a very gritty, low-budget indie approach. He added that big budget gloss would work against the material, plus I'm excited about trying my hand at a more seat-of-the-pants filmmaking approach on this one than I've used in the past. This would not be a studio picture. And over the next year or two, the ownership of it changed, that he moved away from Paramount. And in October 2006, it finally looked like it was coming together, that Dimension Films, under the oversight of its then co-chair, Bob Weinstein, agreed to back the project. Now, Dimension at this stage was firmly in the Stephen King business, that it had already shot and was set to release the film 1408 with John Cusack in the lead role. That had wrapped up. Eli Roth at this point was circling making a film for Dimension as well, based on Stephen King's Cell. Now, that was a project that he'd ultimately back away from. And if memory serves, Cell got made with Samuel L. Jackson in the end, but kind of disappeared a little bit. But in the midst of it all, The Mist was pressing ahead, and Dimension just had to get the rights to Darabont's script back from Paramount, which it ultimately did. So at the point the announcement came in October 2006 that this was moving forward, well, Thomas Jane was already said to be in talks to star for the movie. Now, Darabont would talk of the casting of The Mist over time, and he would say he didn't have the budget for a big movie star anyway. One big movie star was just going to knock the entire cost of the film out, were that the route that they went down. But nonetheless, he was looking for an ensemble of really talented actors. He wasn't necessarily fussed about having big names. Not that Thomas Jane is completely anonymous or anything like that, but he knew the scale, the profile really of the kind of people he was aiming for. And with Thomas Jane in place, the rest of the cast could start to slot into place. Darabont would double down on the film that he was trying to make at this time as well. He said it's time to get down and dirty and make a nasty little character-driven gut punch horror movie. So the plan at this stage was announced that the film would start shooting in the spring of 2007. It would actually start filming just a little bit ahead of that in January 2007, the cast was really fleshed out. That's when Laurie Holden and Andre Braugher came on. Amongst the later additions, pretty much last minute, were Marcia Gay Harden and Toby Jones. William Sadler, Brian Libby were not far behind. And Darabont went into filming with a script that he wanted to make, with Stephen King giving the nod to the script that he wanted to make. And he would say to Coming Soon in an interview that this wasn't the kind of film where it had been a struggle to make it. Rather, that the only reason this one had taken so long to get to the screen was he'd just pursued different opportunities, and it was over time it just bubbled back up. Now, he went into filming with, this is a spoiler-free podcast, and this is the closest I'm going to get to even going vaguely against that grain. Darabont had changed, notably, the ending from the book, from the Stephen King short story, and he'd done so with Stephen King's blessing, that he sent the proposed ending to King. King wrote back and was happy with it. I'll come to that a little bit again shortly. The bottom line here is in February 2007, the film was in a position for shooting to begin. Now, Darabont had set himself some tight parameters in which to make this particular movie. For instance, he had a very tight budget. He was working to, I think it was about $17 million to make this one. He also had 37 days in total to shoot the whole thing. And if you've seen The Mist, there are some really quite complex shots in there, not least special effects shots that had to be woven in. And he had to get some quite elaborate sequences in the can within this very tight amount of time. He also, just to up the difficulty level a little bit more, didn't allow himself any storyboards on this one. I had a great deal of joy reading Ian Nathan's excellent book, Stephen King at the Movies, where they talk about The Mist. And Darabont goes down to the fact that it was the safety net he was looking to take away, that he was looking to make a movie very much in the spirit of the grainy, low-budget genre films he grew up watching, and thus they would be sorting stuff out on the set, that they were looking to get their shots and they were planning their shots without a great big book of storyboards to draw on. They were having to go heavily on instinct. Now, a good chunk of the film's budget was spent building a supermarket. The shooting of the film took place in Shreveport in Louisiana at a studio complex there, and on that studio complex they built a 12,000 square foot food house supermarket, and they built this supermarket in 6 weeks. Now, Darabont had put a guiding ethos to his team on this one, that the film was going to be Lord of the Flies with cool monsters, but nonetheless, to make that believable, they had to make sure that the store where a bulk of the action takes place was right. And so, I mean, just in terms of the design of it, they were talking about they had to make sure that the store was laid out in a way so that cinematically you could follow the action of the movie. Even when directing in that supermarket, I mean, Darabont had to be out the way a little bit, and so they put in a loudspeaker system in order that he could direct over that and be heard by the assorted actors and extras to communicate with the camera operators. The store that they built in the end had 5 checkout lanes, it had 8 aisles, it had lots of the facilities you'd expect of a supermarket. And also, it was fully stocked. That companies on the whole were donating products for product placement, which I just find, again, having seen the film, pretty much bizarre. I personally, when I went to see The Mist, didn't come out thinking I'm looking for a particular brand of crisps that I saw on the shelves of it. I don't know how subtle the product placement was for those amongst you who've seen it. But nonetheless, this wasn't, let's just say, this wasn't kind of the happy film that inspired you necessarily to head off to Asda straight afterwards. So, Darabont also wanted to shoot this in a different way to the 3 major studio features he'd done before. That he wanted to go for a documentary format for The Mist. He wanted to use handheld cameras, and he wanted to stay close to the spirit and the text of the Stephen King book and the films and the aesthetic, the film aesthetics of movies he loved from the 50s and 60s as well. Now, he did have quite a sizable ensemble as well to juggle, who'd come out to Louisiana to shoot the film. And whilst several films have people just coming in and out and shooting their bits and heading off, we discussed that on Frankenstein just before, of people coming in for 2 weeks at a time. In this particular instance, Darabont kept his cast around in case he wanted them or needed them at hand. So for the duration of the just over a month shoot, the vast majority of that cast were constantly there, whether they were necessarily needed or not, which goes to the idea really of just how much they were working out as they were making the film, deliberately so. He had also started shooting the movie on digital, and digital by the back end of the 2000s. Well, more and more filmmakers were moving towards that, particularly indie. I mean, fairly obvious advantages to it. It's far more nimble, it was cheaper, less restrictions on just how much footage you could shoot. But Darabont, when he shot the first little bits of footage, he just didn't like the effect. He thought it was too glossy, and he needed something a bit more gnarly and a bit more down and dirty. And so in an interview he gave with Coming Soon, he talked about how he got in touch with the camera crew for the TV show The Shield. Now, Darabont had directed an episode of the show, and the gritty styling of that was kind of what he wanted to capture. So he just went back to that camera crew to ask how they did it. And I found this in the press kit for The Mist has got quite a lot on this. And it talks about how The Shield pretty much always used 2 cameras, that they were floating cameras, quote, searching for a reaction, an interesting angle, a glint of the light, or an actor who's hitting his lines. And as the director of photography on this particular movie, Ron Schmidt, would explain, the cameras have a lot of free range to shoot any actor at any time. Now, there was special effects work to weave in as well, so there were dots in and around the place that they had to hit as well, but the special effects work on this was particularly nimble. But going back to how they chose to shoot it, by going with the 2 cameras, they just said instead of focusing on one piece of action, there are 2 cameras catching all kinds of bits and pieces, and the operators have permission to follow what is more interesting. A lot of this was not pre-planned. And Darabont was really sold on this less restrictive style. It was described as the film's light bulb moment. It was described that he came out of working on The Shield, and from that point he knew how he was going to do The Mist. And so he shot on a film stock, Fuji 400 ASA, which he described as a very fast film. And he said, quote, we could have easily shot a slower stock, 100 ASA, but that 400 gave us this grain in the image, and that's what he was going for. He was also, as well as the effects stuff, looking for some practicalities to this, and Greg Nicotero came in to do the creature effects stuff as Darabont delved into a pure horror film for the first time. For someone who directed a couple of Stephen King films prior, this was the first one you could describe as an outright horror. Now, Darabont would stay in constant contact with King throughout the making of The Mist, that they would exchange emails pretty much every day, that Darabont would send ideas and what they're up to and ask about ways to do things, and King would remain involved. Now, he would turn down a cameo role in the film, but he would be keen on hearing Darabont's ideas. He was interested. He ceded to Darabont a lot of it by the sounds of it. But going back to that press kit, it was what was King's biggest note after he read Darabont's script. And as Darabont replied, Stephen sent me an email begging me not to have the actors try to attempt main accents in the film because it always sounds like a Pepperidge Farm commercial. I've not seen Pepperidge Farm commercials, but I'll take that at face value. Now, Rowan Schmidt, the director of photography, worked with camera crew Bill Gearhart and Richard Cantu, and Darabont called them the secret weapon that allowed them to make this film so quickly, to be able to shoot it in 37 days. That they were shooting big scenes that had most of the main characters, that Darabont would argue if you shot the usual amount of coverage on a bigger movie, it would have taken a week to get some of the scenes in the can that they got for The Mist in one day. In particular, there is described scene 35. How can I go through this relatively spoiler light? Let's have a go. It is described as a lengthy scene in which mass terror and confusion ensues, which also involves the supermarket. And this was 10 pages of script. And it was the biggest sequence in the film, and they shot it in 6 days in the end. But that 6 days, to put it into context, what this meant for the movie, was 1/6 of the film's entire schedule. The film's physical production then would wrap up, end of March, early April 2007, after those 37 days. Now, there was some post-production work to be done, obviously, apart from the edit, in that there were 300 visual effects shots that had to be brought in. But also, it wasn't going to be long before this one was released. And in fact, Darabont was able to go over the summer to San Diego Comic-Con for his first visit there with one of his films to debut a couple of clips from the movie. And it would be an uncompromised cut of the film that Darabont was able to put out. This was the advantage of going from Paramount to Dimension to mount a film of this. It premiered at the Show East Film Festival in October 2007, so 6 months after filming wrapped up. Its full release would follow in November 2007, and it would be fair to say the response was divisive. If you didn't like nasty, really getting under your skin horror movies that don't particularly compromise, this was not going to be a film for you. And you could almost see a dividing line in some of the critics who went into this looking for the Green Mile or the Shawshank Redemption. This was, far more horrible. There's no way around it. Far more horrible. And in particular, the ending of the film led to what we could politely call quite a lot of discourse. It still remains for me one of the most striking denouements of a film of that particular decade. It was the ending that people were talking about, as much of the fact that the reviews were mixed. That ending, and Darabont chatted about how he arrived at it. And he talked to Coming Soon. He said, well, when I'm adapting King, he always plants little seeds along the way. And he said there's one line in the story that suggested this ending to me, which I can't quote right now because I have a blank on it. But if I did, I'd give the ending away. And Darabont explained how he'd had the rights at the point he came to make the film to The Mist for 13 years. And through the years, he and King would talk casually about it. And every once in a while, King would say, have you thought of an ending yet? And because he knew that the open-ended ending that he provided wasn't necessarily going to fly for a film. So he'd go to me a little bit every once in a while, have you thought of an ending yet? And Darabont eventually said, I actually have an ending in mind and I don't want to pitch it to you. Let me write the script. You can read it, see what you think. Sent him the script, read it, and King just replied and said, I wish I'd thought of that ending. If I had, I'd have used it in the story. So that's not a bad bit of feedback, really. But I doubled down on the story of that ending because it dominated a lot of discussion of The Mist. And actually, The Mist in its entirety, I think, is a really, really good film. And I think the ending makes it a memorable one. Because he had gone through this on a lower budget, because he'd moved away from the traditional Hollywood route, he had the wiggle room to go with this ending. The cost of that to him was the budget was realistically about half the amount that he needed to make the film. And he did have to go on his wits, really, to get the movie made. It opened at like peak time in America. It got, the opening weekend was November the 23rd to the 25th, 2007. And The Mist opened in 9th place with $8.9 million. Not a bad return, really, but just look at what was around that week. Also opening up was Enchanted. I love Enchanted, but crikey, it's not a double bill, is it? That was number 1. There was a film called This Christmas, which had come in at number 2, which I barely remember at all, to be honest. Their first hit band movie was in at number 4. There's a film called August Rush went in at number 7. The holdovers that were in the top 10 at that point were American Gangster, Fred Claus, B-Movie, Beowulf, and then at number 10 on its third week of release was No Country for Old Men, that would build quite a lot over the coming weeks. But I mean, The Mist was the dark choice on that list, and The Mist would get some degree of word of mouth to it as well. Its eventual box office worldwide actually would be $57 million, and in the US, well, American audiences would contribute 25 million of that. And against that backdrop, that's quite a successful return for a low-budget horror film, especially when the core market for horror films was still regarded as being DVD releases and such like. The film, I mean, a mini-series has subsequently been made of The Mist, but it's interesting, the legacy of The Mist, I think, because it comes up on lists of memorable horror films and striking horror films and incredible movie endings. And I don't think at the time when it was being so divisively received, many people necessarily would have called it out that way. But there's a moral of the story, I guess, which is you stick to your guns, you stick to your ending. When you've got something really that bold, sometimes you just got to put it on the screen and see how it goes. Now, as I've explored over a couple of hundred Film Stories episodes, it's not always easy to do that with all the forces that work for and against a movie. Frank Darabont, you have to say, he managed it. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for your time and thank you for listening. If you're not totally bored of my waffle, you can get more of it on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get the entire Film Stories project on Twitter as well. That's at Film Stories Pod. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online, YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. And then there's our website. So if you go to filmstories.co.uk, every weekday we're updating that with lots of movie news, stories, opinions, movie mayhem, bits and bobs there. The Film Stories shop is where you can find all of the back issues of our magazines. There are 35 issues to choose from, not including that includes the sold out ones, so might technically not be accurate. There's also our Blu-ray of Sneakers, which is available in the UK with brand new extra features. We're really, really proud of that. You can find all of that at store.filmstories.co.uk. Finally, just one more quick plug for the Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you want to support this podcast and help us do more stuff like this, that's hugely appreciated. But the most important thing, as ever, is that you all take care, that you all look after yourselves. This podcast would be nothing without you all. I'm very, very grateful for your time and for your ears. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. In the meantime, you all look after yourselves. The very best to you. Take care. Bye-bye.
That's Frankenstein.